Are you as excited as I am about Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn? I'm excited. I'm a boxing nut, for those of you who may not know, that loves the history of the sport. Anyways, Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn are going to be fighting this weekend. Let's chop it up.
Hey, hear him. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier.
Hey, what's up with it, fam? It's Hot Boxing Minute, your favorite pharmaceutical engineer turned boxing analyst, back at you with that uncut, raw realness. Of course, because that's the only way I'm fixing to serve it to anybody, anytime, any place. Chris Eubank Jr., Conor Benn, this Saturday, October 8th, out there across the pond at London's famed O2 Arena, are going to go at it. And this is one of those awesome events in boxing, folks. Very rarely in a boxing fight do you have a narrative and a storyline, a compelling one that pushes itself, much less one that involves generations, family, bloodline, legacy, all the cool mixings and fixings of what makes a fight great. There is almost every single great ingredient in this fight upcoming to make it a great fight. The only thing that's missing is title belts. There is no title belts on the line. Chris Eubank Jr. used to be the IBO champion. As far as I know, he is no longer the super middleweight IBO champion. But regardless, you got Conor Benn, the young, hotshot, blue chip. I want to say he's just outside of being a prospect because he's about 21 and 22 fights in, welterweight, against Chris Eubank Jr. Both of these guys have spent their entire lives under the immense, gargantuan shadows cast upon them by their fathers. Now, for those of you that don't know, Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn, the fathers of both of these two guys who are fighting this weekend, had one of the most epic rivalries in all of boxing. Probably the biggest rivalry in British boxing history in the 1990s. Now, they were both middleweights in this 1990s era, and this 1990s middleweights era was one of the most stacked middleweight eras ever. So, for those that don't know, Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn competed in one of the most stacked 1990s. Oh, sorry, let me say this correctly. So, Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn had one of the greatest rivalries in middleweight boxing history. They competed in the 90s in arguably the most stacked middleweight boxing era. I mean, this is the same era as Roy Jones Jr., Bernard Hopkins, Gerald G-Man McClellan, Mike McCallum, the Body Snatcher, Joe Calzaghe. Then, of course, you had Chris Eubank Sr., you had Nigel Benn, you had guys like Steve Collins. Oh man, the 90s was just splendid for middleweight boxing. And these two guys had a rivalry. They had that first fight in 1990. Where was it at? Did I write it down here? Yes. The National Exhibition Center in Birmingham was that first fight. A few years later, they had the rematch. In that first fight, Chris Eubank Sr. beat Nigel Benn. I want to say he got a stoppage TKO in like one of the last rounds. He had him wobbled by the first round, but Nigel Benn, who was like a hurricane knockout machine, they ended up fighting to a draw in that second fight, which was a much better fight for Nigel Benn. But they were both epic fighters in their era. And their sons, who are competing as professional fighters, have had to live under that shadow themselves. Especially Chris Eubank Jr., because Chris Eubank Jr., who is kind of an outspoken one, much like his dad was, but in a very different way. He would trash talk. I guess his dad would trash talk too, but Chris Eubank Sr., who was just a super gentleman, and Chris Eubank Jr., who I think is kind of seen as like a snobby, entitled brat for much of his career, but he did have some really, really good fights, and he is a solid fighter. I don't want to take away from Chris Eubank Jr. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of Chris Eubank Jr. I'll be honest about that. I don't know what it is about Chris Eubank Jr. Okay, I'm going to say it. I think during the peak of his middleweight powers, when he was at his prime, which I don't really think for sure he is anymore, I could be wrong, he should have fought Triple G. He should have fought Demetrius Andrade. He never had those fights. He did fight Billy Joe Saunders. He lost. He did fight, who was the guy that fought Carl Froch? George Groves. He fought George Groves. He lost. He did have some notable wins. Now, for those of you that don't know, Chris Eubank Jr. is 33 years old. He's 32-2 with 23 knockouts, so he does have power. He's got wins over Gary O'Sullivan, Arthur Abraham, Avni Yildirim, James DeGale. He knocked out Matt Korobov, the one who went to hell and back with Jamal Charlo. And then you've got Conor Benn, 26 years old. He's undefeated, 21-0 with 14 knockouts. He just recently knocked out Chris Van Heerden and Chris Algieri in back-to-back fights. Went the distance with Adrian Granados. So he's been doing very well himself. Both these fighters both have a huge name out there across the pond. Not really so much with USA boxing fans. A lot of USA boxing fans, including myself, are not big on Chris Eubank Jr., but Conor Benn, with those crazy knockouts, has been winning fans out here on this side of the pond. And arguably, not arguably, why not? Boxing fans tend to be quick to acclimate to fighters who knock people out. And Conor Benn has been knocking fools the hell out. You gotta love guys who are knocking people out constantly. So we've got this fight this weekend at the O2. Chris Eubank Jr., known for having pretty good cardio output, his punch output. He's got a decently educated jab, a granite chin. Although my thing about Chris Eubank Jr. is sometimes he will step back to admire his work, which I don't think any fighter should do. You definitely do not want to be sitting back admiring your work when you're fighting a guy like Conor Benn, because Conor Benn has that killer instinct just like his dad does. Oddly enough, I feel like Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. stylistically and technically are better than their fathers, although they haven't really quite achieved as much in their careers. I don't even know if Chris Eubank Jr. will ever get a major title in the middleweight division. Right now you got, Triple G, who's the unified champion with 2 of the belts. You got Jamal Charlo, who has 1 of the belts, and then I guess Janibek Alamkanali, who was another WBO middleweight champion, super middleweight, of course, Canelo Alvarez. And I don't know, there ain't a chance in hell I see Chris Eubank Jr. ever beating Canelo Alvarez. But hey, boxing is a weird place. Who knows? You got Conor Benn, who is relatively green, just started his professional career not too many years ago, but he's been off to a stellar start. Highlight reel knockouts. You got to give credit to Matchroom. Eddie Hearn and those matchmakers have been pairing up Conor Benn with great competition up till this point in his career. And, Conor Benn is explosive and likes to knock people out just like his father. And I don't think he swings quite as wild as his father did, but he appears to have inherited his father's killer instinct and that power. I like Conor Benn in this matchup. Some news involving Chris Eubank Sr. For those of you that don't know, yesterday Chris Eubank. So for those of you that don't know, Chris Eubank Sr. yesterday was admitted into Langford Mental Health Hospital. They didn't give the reasons, but if I had to guess, and this is just a wild guess, it's probably due to anxiety. Chris Eubank Sr. recently lost one of his sons, Sebastian Eubank, last year to a heart attack out there in Dubai. His son was barely 30 years old, or about to turn 30, and was having a child. In addition to, during his professional career, Chris Eubank Sr. almost killed a man, Michael Watson. He gave him a brain hemorrhage, and they had to put him in a medically induced coma. In addition to Nigel Benn, who almost killed a man, Gerald G-Man McClellan, brain clot as well. So I'm sure Chris Eubank Sr. is going through all kinds of things emotionally as his son attempts to cut down to a catch weight, 157 pounds, a weight that Chris Eubank Jr. has not seen, according to his words, since he was 18 years old. Will this weight cut affect Chris Eubank Jr.'s output, which is one of his strengths as a fighter, is his ability to selectively throw out high volumes of punches, and then he'll step back and take a little bit of a break and then continue to throw out volume more. But if he cuts down and it's a bad weight cut, or it's beyond what his body is physically capable of, this can put Conor Benn at an advantage. Now, I'm just going to say this off the top. I really want Conor Benn to win this fight. I love what Conor Benn has done so far at this point in his young career, but I believe that size is going to be a big, big factor. The fact that Chris Eubank Jr. has been competing at the 160 and 168 category at the world level for as many years as he has puts a significant advantage in Chris Eubank Jr.'s court. Plus the experience level. Eubank Jr. has been fighting the significantly better opposition, definitely the more seasoned opposition, as opposed to Conor Benn. Conor Benn has fought former champions and guys who have competed for titles, but they're all what you would consider as a little bit long in the tooth. Chris Algieri, Chris Van Heerden. Chris Van Heerden got mopped up nasty by Errol Spence Jr. Chris Algieri lost to both Errol Spence and Manny Pacquiao, but they're both, at the tail end of their careers, at the back nine of their careers, so to speak. So definitely got to give the edge and experience of competition to Chris Eubank Jr. So I think one of two things is going to happen in this fight. Either Conor Benn gets the knockout, which I hope he does, But Chris Eubank Jr. has shown himself to have a steady and sturdy chin, which could be weakened assuming there's a bad weight cut, because Chris Eubank Jr. said he hasn't cut down or been at 157 pounds since he was 18 years old. But I just don't see it being that big a factor. I think his chin might hold up. I see Chris Eubank Jr. winning this fight by unanimous decision, if not getting knocked out by Conor Benn, but likely it's going to be Chris. I think I'm going to lean towards Chris Eubank Jr. winning by decision. And I hate saying that because I don't like Chris Eubank Jr. He's one of the few fighters I will actually vocally say, I don't like Chris Eubank Jr. He should have fought Triple G. He should have fought Demetrius Andrade. And he's way too pick-me, excited and eager to fight the physically smaller, much less experienced Conor Benn. Anyways, that's my take on this beautiful upcoming fight with a whole lot of history and a whole lot of legacy behind the boxing community. How do you think the fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn plays out? Let me know in the comments section. Hit that like button if you haven't already done so. You better be pressing follow. This is Hot Boxing Minute, the future of boxing analysis on TikTok and YouTube. Peace.